History remembers presidents. It records their laws, wars, and scandals. But sometimes the most powerful force in the White House is not the man sitting at the resolute desk, but the ghost of the woman who is no longer there. In the south transept of St. John's, the Church of the Presidents, a stunning stained glass window depicts neither an ancient saint nor a biblical matriarch, but stands as a glowing shrine to a woman who, technically, never lived in the White House. Her name was Ellen Herndon, a Southern beauty with a voice like dark honey, whose memory outshined the presidency itself. She remains a captivating enigma, a Confederate daughter in a Union world, a talent silenced too soon, and a mystery whose letters were deliberately burned to ash. Today we look past the politics to uncover the reality, the secrets, and the untold story of Ellen Herndon Arthur. She wasn't born into the hustle of New York commerce, but into the slow, humid aristocracy of the American South. Born on August 30th, 1837 at Culpeper Courthouse in Virginia, Ellen Herndon was the only child of a family that treated honor like a currency. Her world was one of high collars, stiff manners, and deep-rooted traditions. But Ellen, or Nell as she was affectionately known, was not merely a decorative flower of the South. She was the daughter of William Lewis Herndon. Herndon wasn't just a naval officer. In the 1850s, he was a celebrity, a genuine American hero. He was the man who had charted the Amazon River, battling the jungle to map the unknown. For Nell, her father was the sun around which her entire life orbited. They lived in Washington, D.C., where her father helped establish the Naval Observatory. It was here, in the shadow of the Capitol, that Nell's character was forged. She was not the classic beauty of the era. She had soft brown hair, large, expressive eyes, and a slightly fragile constitution. She was nearsighted, often squinting or wearing spectacles, which gave her a look of perpetual thoughtful vulnerability. But when she opened her mouth to sing, the vulnerability vanished. Nell possessed a contralto voice of such richness and power that she became a fixture at St. John's Episcopal Church. She sang with a passion that hinted at the depths of emotion beneath her proper Southern exterior. Her social pedigree was impeccable. As a young girl, she was a cherished favorite of the legendary Dolly Madison, the former First Lady who reigned as the Grand Dame of Washington society. From Dolly, Nell learned the art of charm, the weapon of choice for women who could not vote but could certainly rule. By the age of 18, Nell was the total package, wealthy, talented, and fiercely proud of her Virginian heritage. But the year 1857 would bring a catastrophe that ended her childhood in a single violent night, a tragedy that would haunt her for the rest of her life. To understand the magnitude of this loss, we must look back to the exploits that made her father a god in her eyes. In 1851, the United States Navy, eager to expand American influence and commerce, had sent Herndon on a mission that sounded like something out of an adventure novel. He was tasked with exploring the Amazon River Valley. At that time, the Amazon was a green hell, a vast unmapped wilderness teeming with disease, hostile tribes, and unknown dangers. Leaving his wife Frances and teenage daughter Nell behind, Herndon ventured into the heart of South America. For a year, he battled malaria, navigated treacherous waters, and cataloged the flora and fauna of the world's greatest river basin. He traveled over 4,000 miles from the Andes to the Atlantic, often with only a handful of guides. When he returned in 1852, he didn't just bring back maps, he brought back a story. He wrote a book titled Exploration of the Valley of the Amazon. Today, government reports are dry dust, but Herndon's report was a sensation. It was vivid, exciting, and filled with the spirit of manifest destiny. The book became a bestseller. It was widely read by the American public and even influenced writers like Mark Twain. Suddenly, Nell was not just the daughter of a naval captain. She was the daughter of Herndon of the Amazon. She was no longer just a Virginia girl. She was a Washington socialite in training. At the age of 15 and 16, she was moving in circles that included senators, congressmen, and diplomats. But to understand the trauma that broke Ellen Arthur, we must look to the sea. In the late 1850s, the United States was gripped by gold rush fever. The California gold rush had peaked, but the flow of wealth from the West Coast to the eastern banks was a vital artery of the American economy. Before the Transcontinental Railroad, the fastest way to get gold from San Francisco to New York was by ship, down the Pacific coast to Panama, across the isthmus by rail, and then up the Atlantic coast on a steamer. Captain William Lewis Herndon, now a figure of immense respect, was granted a prestigious command. He was the captain of the SS Central America. This was not just a mail ship, it was a floating bank vault. It was known as the Ship of Gold. On September 3, 1857, the SS Central America left Havana, Cuba, bound for New York. She was carrying 477 passengers, 101 crew members, and a staggering amount of gold, approximately 3 tons of it. In today's money, the cargo would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The passengers included successful miners returning home with their fortunes, families reuniting, and businessmen carrying the lifeblood of New York's banks. The first few days of the voyage were calm. The passengers, many of whom had spent years in the rough camps of California, relaxed in the luxury of the steamer, dreaming of the homes and families they would see in New York. Captain Herndon, authoritative and beloved by his crew, walked the decks, a symbol of safety and competence. But off the coast of the Carolinas, the sky turned a bruised purple. The barometer plummeted. They were sailing directly into the path of a hurricane of biblical ferocity. On September 9th, the winds began to howl. By September 11th, the SS Central America was in hell. The hurricane was a monster. Winds screamed at over 100 miles per hour. Waves described by survivors as mountainous battered the ship from all sides. The Central America was a sidewheel steamer, a design that was vulnerable in such extreme conditions. As the ship rolled violently, the paddle wheels would lift out of the water, spinning uselessly in the air, causing the engine to race and shudder. Then, the unthinkable happened. The ship sprang a leak. Water began to rush into the hold. The fires in the boilers, which powered the steam engines and the pumps, were extinguished by the rising water. The engines died. The pumps failed. The ship of gold was now a dead weight, wallowing in the troughs of massive waves, entirely at the mercy of the hurricane. The scenes that unfolded on the SS Central America over the next 48 hours are the stuff of maritime legend, a titanic struggle between human will and the fury of nature. Captain Herndon realized the ship was doomed. He knew that without power, they would eventually founder. But panic was the immediate enemy. He organized a bucket brigade. Passengers, from wealthy merchants to rough miners, stood shoulder to shoulder with the crew, passing buckets of water up from the hold for 30 straight hours. They fought exhaustion and terror, buoyed only by the calm, commanding presence of Nell's father. Herndon had the ship's flag hoisted upside down, the universal signal of distress. Miraculously, on the afternoon of September 12th, a small brig, the Marine, was spotted. The storm had damaged the Marine as well, but it was still afloat. This was the moment of truth. The Central America was sinking. The Marine was too small to take everyone. Captain Herndon issued the order that has since become the gold standard of maritime chivalry: women and children first. The evacuation was a nightmare. The seas were still raging. Lifeboats had to be lowered into the churning waves, rowed to the marine, and then rowed back. It was slow, dangerous work. Men watched as their wives and children were lowered away, knowing they likely would not see them again. Through it all, Captain Herndon stood on the paddle box, shouting orders through a trumpet. He was the calm eye of the storm. He strictly enforced the evacuation order, ensuring that not a single woman or child was left behind. He threatened to shoot any man who tried to rush the boats, but reports say he never had to draw his weapon. His sheer presence commanded obedience. As the final lifeboat pulled away carrying the last of the women, Herndon knew his time was up. The ship was groaning, the hull buckling under the pressure of the ocean. There were still hundreds of men on board, miners who had strapped belts of gold dust around their waists, weighing them down. Survivors who were pulled from the water later recounted Herndon's final acts. He went to his cabin and put on his full dress uniform. He removed the oilskin cover from his cap. He took his watch, a precious family heirloom, and handed it to a passenger who had found a piece of debris to float on, asking him to give it to his wife, Frances, if he survived. Then, William Lewis Herndon took his place on the bridge. He lit a cigar. He stood perfectly still, bracing himself against the railing. As the SS Central America gave a final lurch and slipped beneath the dark, violent waves, taking tons of gold and 425 men with it, Herndon did not flinch. He went down with his ship. He had saved 152 women and children. He had lost his life, but he had kept his honor. News traveled slowly in 1857, but when it arrived, it hit with the force of a physical blow. In New York City, the loss of the gold triggered the Panic of 1857, a financial crisis that shook the global economy. But in a townhouse in Washington, D.C., the loss was not measured in bullion. For 20-year-old Nell Herndon, the news was a sledgehammer. She was waiting for her father's return. She was perhaps preparing for a party or practicing a song on the piano. When the word came, first of the storm, then of the sinking, and finally the confirmation that the captain had gone down with the ship, her world collapsed. She didn't just lose a father, she lost her hero, her guide, and the center of her emotional life. The grief was cataclysmic. Accounts from the time suggest that Nell and her mother were prostrate with shock. They were insensible to all consolation. The psychological impact on Nell cannot be overstated. She was a young woman who had been protected all her life, and suddenly the ocean had swallowed her protector. This trauma planted a seed of anxiety in her that never fully uprooted. It gave her a lifelong terror of the sea and a deep, pervasive melancholia that would resurface in her later years. However, in a twist of cruel irony, the disaster that broke her heart also secured her future. The nation mourned Herndon as a martyr. He was the definition of the Victorian hero, self-sacrificing, brave, and dutiful. Monuments were planned. Ships would later be named after him. To honor his sacrifice, the surviving passengers and the U.S. government felt a debt of honor to his widow and daughter. A subscription fund was raised. The U.S. Congress awarded the Herndon women a substantial financial settlement, equivalent to 3 years of the captain's pay. But the public went further. Survivors and wealthy citizens pooled their money to ensure that the hero's daughter would never know want. Nell and Frances were granted a substantial townhouse in New York City on West 21st Street. They were given enough money to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Nell was now an heiress in her own right, a wealthy, independent woman, but she was also a woman adrift. She and her mother packed their bags and left Washington, leaving behind the memories of the Naval Observatory and the happy days before the storm. They moved to the great cold metropolis of New York City. It was 1858. Nell was 21. She was wearing black mourning silks. She was a Southerner in the heart of the North, a stranger in a city of commerce. She was rich, she was talented, and she was utterly alone. And it was there, in the midst of her mourning in the drawing rooms of New York society, that she was introduced to a tall, impeccably dressed and ambitious young lawyer. He was a man who loved luxury as much as she did, a man with a charm that rivaled her own. His name was Chester Ellen Arthur. In the winter of 1858, New York City was a sprawling, soot-stained engine of commerce, a stark contrast to the slow, genteel rhythms of Virginia that Nell Herndon had left behind. She was 21, draped in the heavy black mourning silks of a daughter who had lost her father to the sea, living in a townhouse purchased with the price of his heroism. She was wealthy, independent, and deeply sorrowful. It was into this atmosphere of grief and displacement that Chester Ellen Arthur stepped. If one were to cast a romantic lead for the second act of Nell's life, Chester Arthur would have been the perfect choice on the surface. Standing over 6 feet tall, with a barrel chest, wavy dark hair, and impeccable manners, Chet Arthur was the definition of a gentleman. He was charming, witty, and possessed a devastatingly smooth social grace. He was a lawyer on the rise, a man who knew which fork to use and which hand to shake. But below the surface they were a paradox. Nell was the daughter of the slave-holding South, raised on the mythos of Virginian aristocracy. Chester was the son of a fiery Baptist abolitionist preacher from Vermont. His father, William Arthur, had spent a lifetime railing against the sins of slavery. Chester himself was a free soil advocate who had worked on legal cases liberating enslaved people who traveled through New York. By all political logic, they should have been enemies. Yet when Nell's cousin, Dabney Herndon, a medical student in New York, introduced them, the attraction was instantaneous and magnetic. Chester was captivated. He was a man who loved luxury and refinement, and Nell, with her aristocratic bearing and that haunting, powerful contralto voice, was the embodiment of the refinement he craved. For Nell, Chester offered stability. He was strong, ambitious, and attentive, a protector to fill the void left by her father. He courted her with the intensity of a campaign, ignoring the grumbles of her Southern relatives who viewed a Yankee lawyer with deep suspicion. They were married on October the 25th, 1859, at Calvary Episcopal Church in New York. The date was chosen with heartbreaking precision. It was the birthday of her late father, Captain Herndon. Even as she pledged her life to Chester, Nell was looking backward, tying her new husband to the memory of the hero she had lost. It was a foreshadowing of the dynamic that would define their marriage, a union always crowded by ghosts. The honeymoon phase of the Arthur marriage was brief, shattered by the tectonic plates of history grinding together. Just 18 months after their wedding, the first shells fell on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. For millions of Americans, the war was a crisis of national identity. For the Arthurs, living at 123 Lexington Avenue, it was a crisis of the heart. Nell Arthur found herself in an impossible position. She was living in the capital of the Union, married to a rising star of the Republican Party, yet her blood and her heart remained stubbornly Virginian. While her neighbors waved the stars and stripes and cheered the marching regiments, Nell secretly wept for the rebels. Her cousins, her childhood friends, practically every male relative she had known in Culpeper and Fredericksburg, were donning Confederate gray. Chester's position made the situation excruciating. He was not just a passive observer, he was a key player in the Union war machine. The governor of New York appointed Chester as the quartermaster general of the state militia. General Arthur was brilliant at his job. He was an administrator of genius efficiency. He organized contracts, inspected uniforms, and ensured that the hundreds of thousands of New York soldiers marching south were well-fed, well-clothed, and well-armed. Every rifle he procured, every bullet he shipped, was destined to be fired at Nell's family. Imagine the dinner table at the Arthur house in 1862. Chester would return home late, exhausted from a day of logistical warfare, smelling of cigar smoke and the stress of the War Department. He was building his career on the destruction of the South. Across from him sat Nell, receiving smuggled letters from Virginia, terrified that the next casualty list would include a Herndon or a Hansbrough. The tension was palpable, a third presence at the table. It is said that Nell privately celebrated Confederate victories. When news came of a Southern triumph at Bull Run or Fredericksburg, she would hide a smile, hoarding the joy like a secret treasure. Chester, attempting to navigate this minefield with his characteristic charm, began to refer to her as his little rebel wife. The nickname was meant to be affectionate, a way to diffuse the political powder keg with humor, but it was also patronizing, a way of dismissing her deep-rooted loyalty as a cute, harmless idiosyncrasy. But it wasn't harmless to Nell. It was her identity. While Chester climbed the ranks, rubbing shoulders with men who spoke of burning the secessionists out, Nell retreated. She stopped singing in public as often. She withdrew into a smaller circle of Southern sympathizers in New York. The war didn't just divide the country. It built a wall down the middle of the Arthur marriage. In the midst of this political turmoil, the Arthurs tried to build a family. Their first child, William Lewis Herndon Arthur, was born in December 1860. Named after Nell's hero father, Billy was the heir to the Herndon legacy. He was a beautiful, bright child, the one undisputed joy in a house fraught with tension. For Nell, Billy was a tangible link to the future, a reason to endure the hostility of New York. For Chester, the boy was his pride, the start of his dynasty. But the 19th century was cruel to parents. In the summer of 1863, just as the war was reaching its bloody crescendo at Gettysburg, a different kind of battle began in the Arthur nursery. Little Billy fell ill. The diagnosis was vague, a convulsive brain ailment, likely meningitis or a severe fever. The doctors of the era were helpless. They could only offer laudanum and cool compresses as the child burned with fever. Nell watched, helpless, as her son slipped away. The trauma of the shipwreck replayed in her mind. Once again, she was losing the most important male figure in her life, and she was powerless to stop it. On July 8, 1863, William Lewis Herndon Arthur died. He was 2.5 years old. The death of her firstborn shattered Nell. She had now lost her father to the water, her homeland to the war, and her son to disease. The grief fundamentally changed her. The little rebel grew quieter, her fragility more pronounced. Her singing, once full of fire, became melancholic, a vessel for her accumulated sorrow. Chester, too, was devastated, but his reaction was different. He buried his grief in work. He threw himself deeper into the machinery of politics, seeking solace in the noise and power of the public sphere. Nell was left to mourn in the silence of the empty nursery. The gap between them widened. She needed a husband. He was becoming a politician. When the cannons finally fell silent in 1865, the Union was preserved, but the South was in ruins. Nell's family fortune in Virginia was gone, her childhood home a memory. She was now fully dependent on her life in New York. Fortunately, financially speaking, life was spectacular. The post-war era exploded into the Gilded Age, a time of unprecedented wealth and ostentation, and Chester Arthur was perfectly positioned to ride the wave. Chester aligned himself with Roscoe Conkling, the powerful Republican boss of New York. Conkling was the master of the stalwart faction, a political machine that ran on patronage, favors, and spoils. Through his loyalty to Conkling, Chester was appointed to the most lucrative post in the federal government, Collector of the Port of New York. This was the Golden Goose. The New York Custom House collected 75% of the nation's customs revenue. The collector controlled over 1,000 jobs and took a percentage of the fines levied on goods. Chester Arthur became a wealthy man, earning more than the President of the United States. The Arthur home at 123 Lexington Avenue became a palace of the Gilded Age. It was stuffed with heavy walnut furniture, Tiffany glass, and velvet drapes. They hosted the Astors, the Vanderbilts, and the Roosevelts. Nell, despite her sorrow, played the role of the perfect hostess. She knew the social codes. She knew how to arrange a dinner for 40, how to soothe the ego of a senator, and how to smile when she wanted to scream. But to the outside world, they were a power couple. Inside, the air was thin and cold. Chester was becoming a creature of the night. He didn't just work at the Custom House. He lived the life of a machine politician. He spent his evenings at Delmonico's restaurant, eating 14-course meals, drinking fine wines, and smoking expensive cigars with his cronies. He was a man's man, reveling in the backroom deals and the smoke-filled rooms. He often didn't come home until 2 or 3 in the morning. Nell was left in the gilded cage. She had 2 more children, Chester Jr., born 1864, and Ellen, known as Nellie, born 1871. But the absence of her husband gnawed at her. She wasn't just lonely, she was resentful. She hated the dirty business of politics that consumed him. She despised the men he associated with, men like Conkling, whom she viewed as vulgar and corrupt. She saw her husband selling his soul for influence, and it disgusted her patrician sensibilities. Rumors began to swirl in New York society. Was the marriage effectively over? Whispers circulated that they slept in separate rooms, that they led separate lives under the same roof. The little rebel was no longer fighting a civil war. She was fighting a war of attrition against her husband's ambition. The final years of the 1870s were a slow descent for Nell. Her health, never robust, began to fail under the strain of her unhappiness and the harsh New York winters. In 1878, another blow struck. Her mother, Frances Herndon, who had been her rock, her fellow survivor of the shipwreck tragedy, and her constant companion in the hostile North, traveled to France for her health. There, in a foreign land, Frances died. Nell was forced to do the unthinkable. She had to travel alone across the Atlantic, the same ocean that had swallowed her father, to retrieve her mother's body. The journey must have been a psychological torture. Every wave that slapped against the hull was a reminder of the Central America. She returned to New York exhausted, physically frail, and spiritually depleted. She was 41 years old, but her spirit was aged by loss. She needed her husband more than ever. She needed comfort, presence, and reassurance. But Chester was busy. He was fighting for his political life. The new president, Rutherford B. Hayes, was a reformer determined to clean up the corruption at the New York Custom House. Hayes fired Arthur in 1878. Chester was humiliated, angry, and obsessed with his political vindication. He spent his days plotting his return to power and his nights commiserating with his stalwart allies. He didn't see the shadow hanging over his wife. He didn't see that she was running out of time. The end came with a banal cruelty. It wasn't a dramatic accident like her father's. It was the quiet, suffocating death of the Victorian sick room. It was Saturday, January 10th, 1880. The winter in New York was unforgiving, the wind whipping off the Hudson River and cutting through the avenues like a knife. Despite feeling unwell, a lingering cough, a fatigue that went down to her bones. Nell refused to shirk her duties. She was a Herndon, and Herndons did what was expected of them. She attended a charity concert to benefit the poor. It was the kind of noblesse oblige she performed flawlessly. After the event, she stood outside the venue waiting for her carriage. The driver was delayed. For several minutes she stood in the biting cold, her thin evening coat offering little protection against the freezing dampness of the city. She shivered, drawing her wrap tighter, but the chill settled deep in her chest. By the time she returned to Lexington Avenue, she was trembling. The next morning, Sunday, she complained of a sore throat. By the afternoon, she was burning with fever. It was pneumonia. In 1880, before antibiotics, pneumonia was known as the captain of the men of death. It struck fast and hard. Nell's lungs filled with fluid. Her breathing became ragged, a desperate gasping for air. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind perhaps wandering back to the warm sun of Virginia or the face of her father. And where was Chester? He was in Albany, the state capital, deep in negotiations with the Republican machine, plotting the upcoming election of 1880. He was chasing the very power that Nell detested. When the first telegram arrived at the Albany Hotel stating that Nell was ill, Chester perhaps didn't grasp the urgency. She had been frail before. He likely thought it was another bout of nerves or a bad cold. But as the hours ticked by, a second telegram arrived, then a third. Come home. She is sinking. The panic finally pierced his political armor. Chester rushed to the train station. The journey from Albany to New York City is a few hours by rail. But that night, it must have felt like a lifetime. The rhythm of the tracks mocked his haste. He sat in the carriage, the smoke of the engine swirling past the window, perhaps realizing for the first time that, while he had been fighting for votes, he was losing his life. He arrived at Lexington Avenue late on the night of January 12th. He ran up the stairs to the master bedroom. The room was quiet, smelling of sickness and burning candles. The doctor stepped back. He was too late to hear her voice. He was too late to ask for forgiveness. Nell had slipped into unconsciousness. She lay there, her breath shallow, the fire of the South fading from her cheeks. She died that same day. She was 42 years old. The shock to Chester was absolute. This man who had spent years prioritizing his political machine over his wife, who had stayed out until dawn while she waited at home, collapsed. Witnesses said he was crushed with grief. He sobbed openly, a broken man. He realized with the terrible clarity that only comes at the end that while he was chasing power, he had lost his anchor. He had won the political game, but he had lost the prize. The weeks following January 12th, 1880, were a blur of black crepe and hushed condolences for Chester Ellen Arthur. The funeral was held at the Church of the Heavenly Rest on Fifth Avenue. The elite of New York society turned out in their droves, judges, generals, and the political bosses who ran the city. They came to pay respects to the charming Mrs. Arthur, but they also watched the widower with keen interest. Chester Arthur was a broken man. The facade of the jovial, back-slapping gentleman boss had cracked. He had spent the last 2 decades climbing the ladder of power, often at the expense of his marriage, only to find that the view from the top was a desolate wasteland without Nell. He told friends that his ambition had died with her. He was 50 years old, wealthy and powerful, but he was drifting. Yet the machinery of American politics does not stop for grief. Just months after laying Nell to rest, the Republican National Convention gathered in Chicago. The party was fractured. The stalwarts, led by Arthur's mentor Roscoe Conkling, wanted to bring back former President Ulysses S. Grant. The half-breeds wanted James G. Blaine. After days of deadlock, the convention compromised on a dark horse candidate, James A. Garfield of Ohio. To heal the rift in the party, the vice presidency had to be offered to a stalwart, a New Yorker. The slot was offered to Chester Arthur. In a normal timeline, this would have been the pinnacle of Chester's career. But the Chester Arthur of 1880 was different. When he told Roscoe Conkling of the offer, Conkling, arrogant and controlling, ordered him to refuse. Conkling thought Garfield would lose and didn't want his lieutenant associated with a sinking ship. For 20 years, Chester had been Conkling's obedient lapdog, but this time the ghost of his independence flared. He looked his boss in the eye and said, "The office of the vice president is a greater honor than I ever dreamed of attaining." He accepted the nomination. Why? Perhaps it was defiance. Perhaps it was a desire to escape the empty house on Lexington Avenue. Or perhaps, in his grief, he simply realized that he had nothing left to lose. He told a friend during the campaign, "Honors to me now are not what they once were." The prize had lost its luster because the woman he wanted to share it with was gone. The Garfield Arthur ticket won the election of 1880 by a razor-thin margin. On March 4th, 1881, Chester Arthur was sworn in as vice president. He stood on the Capitol steps, looking regal in his attire, but his eyes were sad. He was now the second highest officer in the land, but he was alone. History, however, was not done with Chester Arthur. It had one more violent twist in store, one that would force him to confront his past and his character. On the morning of July 2nd, 1881, President James Garfield was walking through the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. A deranged lawyer and disappointed office seeker named Charles Guiteau stepped out of the shadows. He raised a British Bulldog revolver and fired 2 shots into the president's back. As the police seized Guiteau, the assassin shouted words that would freeze the blood of the nation. "I am a stalwart of the stalwarts. Arthur is president now." The implication was horrific. The assassin was claiming that he had shot the president to make Chester Arthur, the symbol of corruption, the crony of the New York machine, the leader of the free world. The nation was plunged into hysteria. Was this a coup? Was Arthur involved? The public revulsion toward Chester was immediate and visceral. Newspapers openly questioned his character. He was caricatured as a fop, a dandy, a corrupt lackey who spent his time drinking and scheming. The idea of Chet Arthur in the White House was treated as a national calamity. A prominent diplomat exclaimed, "Chet Arthur, President of the United States? Good God!" For Chester, the summer of 1881 was a living nightmare. Garfield did not die immediately. He lingered for 80 days, suffering from infection and botched medical care. During those long, sweltering months, Chester Arthur was a pariah in his own city. He could not go to the White House. He could not return to New York. He stayed in his Washington rental, blinds drawn, terrified to step outside for fear of being assassinated himself. It was in this crucible of isolation and public hatred that the transformation began. Alone in the dark, stripped of his friends, accused of being a monster, Chester Arthur had to look into the mirror. He saw the man he had become, the man Nell had resented, and he decided in the quiet communion with his grief that he would not be that man anymore. On September 19th, 1881, President Garfield died. In the middle of the night in his New York townhouse, where he had returned to wait for the end, a messenger arrived with the news. Chester Arthur, eyes red from weeping, stood in his parlor, the same parlor where Nell's coffin had lain just 20 months earlier. He took the oath of office at 2:15 a.m. He was now the 21st President of the United States. The man who entered the presidency was not the gentleman boss. He was a man possessed by a need for redemption. When Arthur moved into the White House, he brought his grief with him like a piece of luggage. He was appalled by the state of the executive mansion. It was shabby, he declared. He refused to live there until it was renovated. He auctioned off wagon loads of old furniture, a historical tragedy in itself, and commissioned Louis Comfort Tiffany to redesign the interior. He turned the White House into a Gilded Age palace, filled with screens of colored glass, silver leaf, and exotic plants. It was the kind of home Nell would have loved. It was a tribute to her taste, a stage built for a leading lady who would never arrive. Because there was no first lady, Arthur asked his younger sister, Mary McElroy, to serve as the official hostess during the winter social season. Mary was charming and capable, but Chester made it brutally clear. She was a stand-in. The place of honor in his heart was occupied. In the president's private suite on the second floor, Chester created a sanctuary. He placed a framed photograph of Ellen, captured in profile, looking soft and thoughtful, on the mantelpiece of his bedroom. He established a ritual that he would maintain with religious devotion for the entirety of his term. Every morning he ordered the White House gardeners to cut fresh flowers. Often he requested violets or roses. He would personally arrange them in a vase next to Nell's picture. The staff knew never to touch the display. It was a daily act of penance. The most powerful man in America began his day not with intelligence briefings or cabinet meetings, but with a quiet moment of communion with his dead wife. He was apologizing. He was telling her that he was trying. But the most public and poignant display of his undying devotion was found not inside the White House, but across the square. St. John's Episcopal Church sits directly across Lafayette Square from the White House. It is known as the Church of the Presidents. It was also the church where Nell had sung in the choir during her youth, back when she was the happy daughter of Captain Herndon. Chester wanted to memorialize her there. He commissioned a stained glass window to be installed in the south transept of the church. But he had a specific request regarding its placement. He wanted the window positioned so that it faced the White House. The window depicts the angels of the resurrection. It is a beautiful piece of art, glowing with reds, blues, and golds. But its true function was personal. From the window of the president's bedroom on the second floor of the White House, Chester could look out across the trees of the park. At night, when the candles and gas lights were lit inside the church for evening services, the window would glow in the darkness. Historical accounts and rumors from the White House staff paint a haunting picture. They speak of the president late at night, after the state dinners were over and the guests had gone. He would not sleep. Instead, he would sit by the window smoking a cigar, staring across the square at that glowing rectangle of colored glass. He wasn't looking at a church. He was looking for Nell. He told a friend, "She is with me. I feel her presence." In the crushing loneliness of the presidency, where he was surrounded by people who wanted things from him, Nell was the only one who wanted nothing. Her memory became his conscience. When he had a difficult decision to make, he would reportedly ask himself what Nell would expect him to do. She had always hated the corruption, the dirty side of his work. She had wanted him to be a hero like her father. And so, under the gaze of the ghost in the window, Chester Arthur set out to do the impossible. He set out to clean up the government. The political world expected President Arthur to open the floodgates of corruption. His old boss, Roscoe Conkling, rubbed his hands in glee. Chet is president, Conkling thought. Now we own the White House. Conkling arrived in Washington expecting to be named Secretary of State or to be given control over all federal appointments. He expected the old game of patronage to continue, but on a grander scale. But the Chester Arthur he met was icy and distant. "Mr. Conkling, Arthur reportedly said during one tense meeting. "I may be president of the United States, but my private life is nobody's damn business." This was a warning. The old days of drinking and scheming were over. Then Arthur dropped the hammer. In 1883, he signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. This piece of legislation is dry and boring to modern eyes, but in 1883, it was a revolution. It effectively outlawed the spoils system. No longer could politicians give government jobs to their unqualified friends in exchange for kickbacks. Jobs would now be awarded based on merit and examinations. It was the very system that had made Chester Arthur rich. It was the ladder he had climbed, and now he was kicking it away. The stalwarts were stunned. They called him a traitor. They called him an ingrate. Roscoe Conkling was apoplectic with rage, realizing that his former protege had destroyed his power base. The political machine that had built Arthur turned on him with a vengeance. But Arthur didn't care. He wasn't working for Roscoe Conkling anymore. He was working for the approval of the woman in the stained glass window. He knew that Nell had despised the patronage system. She had been a woman of honor, raised by a man who died for duty. Chester wanted to be the man she had believed him to be when they married in 1859. He vetoed pork barrel spending bills. He prosecuted corruption in the post office. He rebuilt the United States Navy, transforming it from a rotting collection of wooden ships into a modern steel fleet, a tribute, perhaps, to his father-in-law, the naval hero. The transformation was miraculous. A newspaper that had once called him a monstrosity wrote, "No man ever entered the presidency so profoundly and widely distrusted, and no one ever retired more generally respected." Mark Twain, a cynic who usually despised politicians, said of Arthur, "It would be hard to better President Arthur's administration." But redemption has a cost. The stress of the presidency, the isolation, and the grief took a toll on Arthur's body. Unbeknownst to the public, Arthur was dying. Early in his presidency, he was diagnosed with Bright's disease, a fatal kidney ailment. It caused fatigue, nausea, and fluid retention. In the 1880s, there was no cure. The doctors told him he had a few years at best. A lesser man might have resigned. A selfish man might have spent his remaining time in luxury. But Arthur kept the secret. He continued to work, to host state dinners, and to fight for reform, all while enduring chronic pain. He knew he was living on borrowed time. This knowledge likely deepened his spiritual connection to Nell. He was walking toward the grave, and he wanted to make sure his soul was clean when he arrived. As the election of 1884 approached, the Republican Party, confused by his reforms and angry at his betrayal of the old guard, was unsure what to do with him. Arthur made a half-hearted attempt for the nomination, but his heart wasn't in it. He knew he was too sick to serve another term. When he lost the nomination to James G. Blaine, he didn't fight. He was relieved. He had done what he set out to do. He had saved the presidency from scandal. He had proven that a machine man could become a statesman. He had honored the memory of Captain Herndon. But there was one final task left to complete, one final act to protect the memory of his wife. As he prepared to leave the White House in 1885, Chester Arthur began to sort through his papers. He looked at the stacks of letters, correspondence from the war, political deals, and most importantly, the intimate letters between him and Nell. He looked at the fireplace. He knew that history would come looking for them. He knew that biographers would want to pry into the little rebel's Confederate sympathies. They would want to read about the marital fights, the cold nights, the little rebel nickname, and the deep, painful rifts caused by the Civil War. He didn't want the world to know her as a Confederate sympathizer or a neglected wife. He wanted her to remain perfect, frozen in amber. He called for a trash can. He had spent 4 years protecting the memory of Nell Herndon Arthur from the public eye. He had kept her photo on his mantelpiece, refreshed her flowers daily, and looked for her light in the church window. But he knew that history is a voracious beast. He knew that once he was dead, biographers, journalists, and historians would descend upon his papers like vultures. They would look for the dirt. They would want to know about the little rebel who cheered for the Confederacy while her husband armed the Union. They would want to read the letters from the dark days of the 1870s, where Nell's loneliness and resentment bled onto the page. They would try to dissect the anatomy of their marriage, the coldness, the separation, the gilded cage. Chester Arthur decided that history would not have that satisfaction. In the days before he left Washington, and continuing after he returned to his Lexington Avenue home in New York, Arthur ordered a great purging. He didn't just burn a few letters, he burned everything. Witnesses described a scene of almost manic destruction. Large garbage cans were filled with documents, state papers, private correspondence, diaries, and notes. The fireplace roared for hours. Arthur presided over the bonfire himself. When his son Chester Jr. tried to intervene, begging his father to save the historical record, Arthur was immovable. "No," he reportedly said, "these papers are mine. They belong to me and to her." Into the flames went the dark records of the corrupt machine politics he had abandoned, mixed with the intimate letters of a marriage he failed to nurture. Into the flames went the evidence of their fights, their reconciliations, and their private jokes. It was an act of vandalism against history, allowing him to erase the sins of his career while sealing the sanctity of his love. He was ensuring that the Nell the world remembered would not be the bitter, lonely woman of the late 1870s, but the radiant, singing belle of 1859. He was curating their love story by destroying the evidence of its pain. As the smoke drifted up the chimney of 123 Lexington Avenue, the true inner life of Chester and Ellen Arthur vanished. What remains to us today are fragments, secondary sources, rumors, and the few innocuous items that escaped the fire. He took their secrets to the grave, leaving us only with the silhouette of a romance rather than the detailed portrait. Chester Arthur left the presidency on March 4th, 1885. He was succeeded by Grover Cleveland. As he rode away from the inauguration, he looked haggard. The gentleman boss, once the most fashion-conscious and convivial man in New York, was a shell of his former self. He returned to the house on Lexington Avenue, the house where Nell had died 5 years earlier. It must have been a haunting homecoming. The furniture was the same, the rooms were the same, but the silence was deafening. Arthur tried to resume his law practice, but his energy was gone. The Bright's disease was entering its terminal phase. He spent his days in his library, surrounded by the few books and mementos he had kept. He was not alone, however. He was surrounded by the affection of a nation that had learned to love him. The man who had entered the White House as a pariah left it as a hero. Mark Twain's praise echoed the sentiments of many. Arthur had proven that the office could elevate the man. But Arthur's thoughts were not on his legacy. They were on the past. He spent time with his children, Chester Jr. and Nellie. Nellie was now a teenager, and in her, he likely saw echoes of her mother, the same eyes, perhaps the same tilt of the head. In November 1886, just 20 months after leaving office, the end came. Arthur was confined to his bed. He drifted into delirium. Those who were with him in the final hours said he was calm. He had made his peace with God, and he had made his peace with his conscience. On the morning of November 18, 1886, Chester Allen Arthur died. He was 57 years old. The death announcement was simple. The newspapers ran black borders. The flags were lowered to half-staff, but for those who knew the story of the ghost in the window, there was a sense of completion. The long vigil was over. The president had finally gone to join the First Lady. They did not bury him in New York City, the scene of his political battles and his Gilded Age triumphs. They took him upstate to the Albany Rural Cemetery in Menands, New York. The funeral was a grand affair attended by the current president, Grover Cleveland, former President Hayes, and the titans of American industry and politics. It was the state funeral of a man who had saved the dignity of the office. But the most significant detail of the burial was not the dignitaries. It was the location. Chester Arthur was laid to rest in the Arthur family plot. He was buried directly beside Ellen Herndon Arthur. The family erected a magnificent monument over the grave, a bronze angel of sorrow standing next to a granite sarcophagus. The angel leans casually, almost wearily against the tomb, drooping a wing in a gesture of infinite sadness. It is one of the most poignant monuments in the cemetery. Underneath the stone, the Union general and the little rebel were finally at peace. The Civil War was over. The political schemes were forgotten. The burning of the papers had ensured that their slumber would be undisturbed by the prying eyes of future generations. They were just Chet and Nell again, united in the earth of New York, far from the jungles of the Amazon and the storms of the Atlantic. If you go to Washington, D.C. today, you can still find the traces of this tragic love story if you know where to look. You can walk past the White House. You can look up at the second-floor windows of the private residence. It is easy to imagine the silhouette of a large man with mutton chop whiskers, standing there in the dark, the end of his cigar glowing like a dying star. But to truly see what he saw, you must cross Lafayette Square. You must go to St. John's Episcopal Church. Walk into the south transept. There you will find the stained glass window. It was designed by Charles Booth, and it depicts the resurrection. It is not the most famous artwork in Washington. Most tourists walk past it without a second glance, rushing to see the Lincoln Memorial or the Capitol Rotunda. But if you stand there as the sun sets, when the light hits the glass just right, the colors blaze with an intensity that takes your breath away. This window is not just a piece of religious decoration, it is a portal. It is the physical manifestation of a grief that changed history. It is the reason the Pendleton Act exists. It is the reason the U.S. Navy was modernized. It is the reason a corrupt politician became a good man. The window is a testament to the idea that love, even a difficult, fractured, tragic love, can be a force for redemption. It reminds us that the people we lose do not truly leave us. They sit on our shoulders. They whisper in our ears. They demand that we be better than we are. History is often taught as a sequence of dates and battles. We learn that Garfield was shot in 1881. We learn that Arthur signed the Civil Service Reform Act in 1883. We learn that he died in 1886. But dates are just the skeleton of history. Emotion is the blood. The story of Chester and Ellen Arthur is a reminder that the White House is not just a government building. It is a home. And like any home, it is haunted by the joys and sorrows of the people who live there. We began this story with a paradox, a war criminal of corruption who became a hero of reform. We asked why this happened. The answer, it turns out, was not political ambition or sudden moral enlightenment. The answer was a woman named Nell. She was the Southern belle who died of pneumonia because she waited too long in the cold. She was the daughter of the hero who went down with the ship. She was the wife who felt neglected and unloved. But in death, she became powerful. She became the conscience of a president. She saved him from himself. So the next time you hear about the forgotten presidents of the late 19th century, spare a thought for Chester Arthur. And when you do, don't picture him signing laws or arguing with Congress. Picture him in the dead of night, in the silence of the executive mansion. Picture him placing a single fresh violet next to a silver-framed photograph. Picture him looking out the window across the dark and empty park, watching the lights of St. John's Church flicker in the wind. He isn't looking at the country he rules. He is looking for the wife he failed. And in that gaze, in that regret, and in that enduring love, we find the human heart of history.